Greetings viewers, Eric the Car Guy here. In this episode I will be covering the installation of a power steering rack. Yes, I said power steering rack. Initially I was putting a manual rack in the Ford. I've since decided to go with power steering just for, well, comfort. I'm going to be driving this car in the street for the most part, and I need to be mindful of that. But more importantly, I'm also going to be installing a set of solid rack bushings. Normally power steering racks or steering racks come with rubber bushings installed and they mount to the chassis. And the reason they do this is for your comfort, so that as you're driving down the road and you're hitting bumps, you don't get a lot of feedback through the steering wheel. However, you do give up a little bit of steering accuracy through that rubber compliance that's happening as you turn the wheel. Now I'm going to be installing solid bushings, and yes, I'll be, well, getting a lot more feedback through the steering wheel. However, my steering will be more accurate as a result. So even if you don't plan on installing, say, a new power steering rack in your Fox body, you could install a set of these solid bushings and get better steering feel just from doing that alone. And especially if they're maybe soaked with oil or worn out or something like that, you can do a lot to improve the handling of your vehicle just by installing these solid bushings. I'll put links in the description to part numbers and things like that, stuff that seems important. This information will apply to Fox bodies, so from 79 to 93 and actually a little bit beyond that. So if you got a Ford Mustang, this information is useful to you. Right now we're going to jump into the action. Take it away, Eric. Check out my new power steering rack. Yes, I've decided to go with power steering. In order to install this onto our K-member, we're going to have to go through this goofy set of shafts and all this other kind of stuff. Don't worry about that. So we have to remove the rubber mounting bushings from the rack. So when we mount this into the vehicle, we want to mount it as high as possible. These are what goes in the front here. We may have to spin them around a little. And then on the back side, this goes on like this. And then there's another washer that goes on like this and makes it all flat. I believe what we want here is that one. Well, we're not going to get that one. We're not going to get that one either. We're not going to get any of these with this steering rack setup. Not with this bolt anyway. And we're back. When we last left, we were installing the power steering rack, and we found that the bolts would not go through these holes. It was kind of frustrating. In fact, I went and purchased another set just for fastening a power steering rack to a Fox body. These are the actual bolts. Still no joy. So I had to go to the hardware store, get some other bolts that are smaller. I thought about drilling this out, but I talked to the people at Maximum Motorsports and they were very adamant about me not doing that very thing. And partly because, as you can probably see up there, how thin that is. As a result, if you did drill it out, that thinness could go away completely and thus compromise the bushing, but also there's the danger of not drilling completely straight. So if I did drill it, I'd have to do it in a drill press, and so much easier to get a smaller fastener, but I don't necessarily like the fact that it's smaller. They say it's going to work fine. Anyway, this is how we're going to solve that problem, and at the very least get the power steering rack mounted up under this K-member. These are my new bolts. These are the old bolts that came in a kit. I can link them in the description for you, but as I said, if you're using these Maximum Motorsport bushings, the stock ones aren't going to do any good at all. These were 7/16 by 6. I also picked up some lock washers because these come with nylock nuts. They've got that little nylon ring on the inside of there to where when it hits the threads, it helps to lock the nut in place. The new fasteners that I have here don't have any such provision, so I have lock washers along with regular washers, so it's going to be stacked up something like that. Here's our rack again. We've already removed those bushings from before. Here are the new bushings and all the fasteners. They're going to go with all that stuff that I've left here on the cart. Now I've already sort of test fit this up into place, and there's already a problem for where I'm looking to mount it, and that is I have some interference up here with these lines. So when I put this up in here and I try to mount this with those bushings, that line is interfering with the bottom of the K-member there. So I need to bend that line over a little bit so I can get that into place. I'm just going to leave this bolted in. and gently tap it. So far, so good. These are the power steering lines here that I'm also going to address. At least I'm going to make the connections to the rack. Obviously, I'm going to have to work to make the connections elsewhere, but it just seems like there's going to be no better time than to hook this stuff up than when nothing's in the way. These bushings go in place of the rubber bushings, and Maxima Motorsports recommends that you mount this as high as possible inside the or onto the K-member. Then on the back side, this will be like this. So I will put this back here in like this, so this doesn't move around. All right, so I've got my bolt, a washer. I'm not going to put the lock washer on this side. Washer through that one. Also on this side, I'm going through the same one. Let's see if it will mount up there now. On the back side, put a washer, lock washer, and the nut. Over here, same thing. Okay, I want to try to get this in here level. You can adjust these and you can see that there's a lot of movement up and down before you tighten these down. I want to make sure that these are straight up and down on both sides. So I busted out my level just to see. And the first thing I wanted to ask was, well, is the car level on the lift? And this may not be the best place to do this, but at least it gives me some idea. So maybe close enough. I'm gonna try to transfer that over to here. And it looks like almost identical on here as it did over there. So the bubble's just a little bit to the left. Seems level enough. I feel confident in tightening this down. All right, something recommended in the instructions is they want to make sure that the orientation of these bushings stays put or as close to where it needs to be as possible. So try to get them lined up to where everything is straight up and down, and then mark where they rest. More importantly, this secondary one here, try to get that so that it lines up. So that way if it's up on there and this gets moved in one position or another, you're able to line everything up again. Do the same to the other side. I'm not going to tighten these up just yet. The main reason is the other thing I'm waiting on is a new steering shaft to go between here and here, the steering column and the top of the steering rack. This piece here is missing, and I may have to drop the rack down slightly in order to insert that. So I kind of don't want to tighten everything down just yet, but at least I've got everything into position, snug down. I can see that the marks that I made are lined up. So I know my bushings are in the correct orientation. Now let's move on to some tie rod ends. Looks like my massaging gave me the clearance that I was looking for. I'm not going with the Maxima Motorsports tie rod ends just yet. I'm going to see if I can make it work with these Steedy units that I had on here before. I'm also going to set these up so that I've got the maximum amount of adjustment as well, but I'm going to need a tool. I want to make sure I've got plenty of threads in here. So I'll run that in about to there. So I'm sure to have plenty of thread engagement. All right, just for funsies, I'm going to count the threads on both of these and try to make them the same. 5, 6, looks like right around 6. The same on this side. 4, 5, 6. And I'm leaving all this stuff loose because obviously it's going to come apart to do adjustments later. I'm going to do the same thing on here and count the threads back to the nut and leave myself plenty of space to make sure that there's lots of thread engagement. And I'm not even going to bother trying to center this up until I've got the steering wheel and everything connected, but at least this way the connections and everything should be even. 16, 17, 18. But this way we're sure we've got plenty of threads going in here and plenty of threads going in here, so we're not like right at the very edge. Yay, we're steering again. I'm going to need to go back and do a bump steer adjustment here, and these may not be the final answer as far as the tie rod ends go. Therefore, I'm not tightening this fastener down fully until I know for sure where we stand here. Just to satisfy my own curiosity, I'm going to fasten the power steering lines up into place. Make sure that they all work as intended. This is low pressure. This is going to come off the rack and go to the cooler, which is this guy, which should sit up in the front of the radiator or something. And then out of the cooler, I have another hose that will go back to the reservoir and the power steering pump. Then there's the connection of the high pressure line that will go from the rack to the power steering pump. So I figure if I get these in place now, since I've got all kinds of access, there's no engine in the way, I can at least get these threaded in. I don't know if I will tighten them down just yet, but if nothing else, I'll have them in position. I suppose my first order of business is to try to figure out who's low pressure and who's high pressure up here. One of these is obviously larger, one is smaller. I think these are the two connections that go to the rack, if I'm looking at this right. And the low pressure is larger, the high pressure is smaller. Okay, so it looks like this would be low pressure and this would be high pressure. Before we go up in there, I want to install the O-rings. This one goes to the low pressure side. I'm not going to put this in here dry. I have some transmission fluid. Just going to coat the outside of it with. I do the same on the high pressure. Since there's only one O-ring that's going to go with that. This one will have two. They left me those nice caps too. Okay, a big and a small. Kind of seems self-evident. Even though I'm not hooking up the power steering pump yet, still seems right to do this. I'm going to take advantage of these caps and use that one there for now. Shane Craig hooked me up with these other plugs, so I'm just going to install one now, just to keep that plugged off while we work. Near as I can figure, this is the high pressure line. It should come in like this. And as I said, it's the smaller one. Because the power steering rack is moved up, there is some contact with the K-member up here, so I'm going to have to bend this down a little bit to get this to fit. This seems like the easiest way to accomplish this. Just very gently bending it down. All right, let's see if we can get that low pressure line in there. I think this one will be like this. I'm just threading these in now because it's, well, convenient. I'm going to tighten them up later when I've got everything in position. At least now, we know where our hydraulic lines will be going. And I can check for interference with the engine and everything else when I drop it back down in to make sure that all the lines clear. Just to keep all the parts together, I've taken this brace and just loosely threaded it up into place. I need to remove this before installing the engine again, but for now, I know where it is and where the fasteners are. Now that the suspension and the rack and everything is in place, I'm going to bolt the wheels on just to check clearance with everything. And also so I can roll around the shop again. Uh-oh. That's a problem. Well, there's your problem right there. We're coming into contact with the coilovers. After some time on the internet and a little research, this is a solution I've come up with. This is a 1/4-inch wheel spacer. It goes between the wheel and the brake rotor here underneath the studs. And this will move the wheel out 1/4 of an inch. Concern with this is that I may also have to get longer studs because this is going to make it so I have less usable space on the studs. So let's install it and see if it at least solves the problem with clearance. This is a 4.5 by 5 inch bolt pattern. I got something that's relatively universal here. I already see something I don't like, and that's that this can move all around. So I've got a thought on this to where I can sort of marry this up to the brake rotor in just the position that I want, and it won't be harmful to anything. RTV on the back side of this to act as something of an adhesive to hold this where I want it to go. Doesn't need to be a lot, it just needs to stay on there long enough till I tighten the bolts down. Well, it's not going to stay long. Sounds like it solved it. And it did. Got plenty of room. But as I suspected, I'm going to have to get some longer studs to accommodate this. I'd rather have a little bit of the stud sticking out of the top and full thread engagement here at the wheels. I'd love to see it more like this. So I guess I'll get studs that are about a 1/4 inch longer. It's 12 millimeters, so it's 12 by 125 by, right now it's 1.5. So I'm going to need 1 3/4 or 2. And I'll need 10 of those things. Yeesh. Now, initially I was, and many of you are concerned about the positioning of the front wheels inside the wheel wells being moved forward. That is actually by design. And in fact, when I selected these lower control arms and this K-member, I wanted to make sure of that very thing. I wanted to have that same offset. And the reason is it moves the weight of the engine and transmission back in towards the center of the vehicle, which makes for better handling. However, there may be some clearance issues. Now, I don't have the engine installed yet or the transmission, so the weight of either of those things isn't coming into play right now. But if nothing else, we can see where things sit so we can tell whatever adjustments we're going to need to make on the fenders to give us clearance so we can turn the wheels. That's cool. I love where that wheel's sitting just as it is. I really wish I had the steering shaft installed so I could turn this back and forth, but I love, as far as the ride height goes, where it's sitting. It's obviously going to be different with the engine and transmission. Well, we are going to have to adjust ride height in both the front and the back before it's all said and done, but we still have some closeness up here, and I probably will have to modify the fender a little bit in order to get this all to work. And I don't know if the fact that I've spaced the wheel out is also coming into play, but I love this spacing here as far as how this gets tucked up into the top of the fender like that. I don't mind this big gap back here because I'm building this car for performance, not so much for appearance. In fact, that's the whole point, is that it doesn't look like much, but it goes like much. That sounded dumb, but you get the point. It sure does look pretty down in there, all that new stuff. Suspension hardly has any give at all. I mean, a little bit, but it is adjustable. The dampers, the front dampers are adjustable, so I can change the rates in the front. Once again, not doing anything with the stabilizer bar until the engine is installed and I can check all my clearances, because I'm fairly certain with relocating that stabilizer forward like I am, that I'm going to have to take a little bit off that relocation kit in order to clear my oil filter. I know everything isn't completely locked down yet, but I want to move the wheels lock to lock just to check clearances and everything, especially up in this area. Also want to check my brake hoses and see if they're overly stressed. So far that doesn't look bad. This side gets compressed, so that's okay. As far as the rack boot and the spacing and everything, there's just enough, but just enough is enough. Okay, well, all the way over, it's making contact with the brake line. Now I'll turn it to the other lock just to check. Brake line over here seems a little stressed. I might end up bending those brackets they attach to try to give those a little more slack. And I realize it'll be different when it's on the ground and the suspension is compressed a little bit, but it's nice to know that, you know, at full drop that I'm not going to have a problem. Doesn't seem to be the same issues over here as there were over there. Maybe I could just bend the brake line a little bit. Well, I spoke too soon. I haven't fully tightened those brake lines down yet. I just put them in a position just so that they would be there. So it does appear that some steering stops are in order. These are my new steering stops. So they're just little plastic rings that will go on the inner part of the power steering rack and limit its travel from one direction to the other. I have what looks like 6 of these things here. I'm just going to go by the fact that all these are this same part number, this 80, 804, 842. So I'm going to assume that means they're all the same. In order to install these, I'm going to have to cut this. This is just a plastic zip tie on both sides. Now, I don't have one that thick to replace it. I don't think that's going to matter. There's a lip on the inside of here that should cover it, but I need to cut both of those and then move the inner rack boots so that I can access the rack to install those stops. All right, let's move the rack out on that side. These are simple. I just slide it up onto here and it'll limit the travel. It won't allow it to go any farther. See how hard that was? I'm gonna just take this out altogether. It's just an equalization tube between the 2 boots on both sides. I just need to make sure that it gets back up in there. Do the other side and then we'll check the travel. So far on this side, it's not hitting that brake line anymore, but it's just missing it. But I could probably bend that brake line up out of the way. As far as this side, this brake line looks fine. I'm gonna pop that wheel off and see if I can get that to fit a little better. I had taken this clip that holds this in here out. Put the wheel back on. That looks way better to me. Can't forget about our equalizing tube. I don't really think it matters what side it goes into so long as you remember to install it. I am a little worried when I put the engine in, if it's going to come in contact with this. The exhaust pipe comes down right here. We'll see if it's a problem. Yes, I am using smaller zip ties. I don't think it'll matter much, but either way, even if these aren't adequate, It's not like they're going to be difficult to change. Well, that wraps up the installation of a power steering rack and also solid rack bushings on a Fox body, thrown in with a bunch of other information as well. Know that I did go back and install a couple more of those plastic rings, in fact one. So now I have 2 of those plastic steering stops on the steering rack now. I found that I didn't quite have the clearance that I wanted, so I just added 1 more of those little rings. I had 6 altogether. You can stack those up. Just know that the more of those that you stack up and you put on the rack, the less steering you're going to have. So in other words, when you go lock to lock, you're going to have just a little bit less with each time, but it helps solve clearance issues like it did for me. Now I kind of feel bad because I went through all this trouble the last time with these other low control arms to make my own steering stops. These are all adjustable. This is just a piece of pipe with a couple of nuts welded here, this one being the lock nut, and I was able to turn this bolt in and out. I was really proud of my fabrication on this and how well it worked. Problem is, it turned out to be completely unnecessary because, well, as you saw, those little plastic clips are inexpensive and they just clip right on, and a zip tie later you're done. So that should help save you some time if nothing else. Now, the last time I posted a video about my front suspension and talked about the tire clearance against the coilovers, I talked about my wheel spacers. Well, a lot of you seem to have issues with that, and not because of that, but because I wanted to make things easier for myself. I took these to my fabricator, and he has since made them hub-centric. So in other words, he's added this inner ring here, so when I put these on the hub, they just slide right on and they don't have any slop whatsoever. Being towards the inside of the wheel, and also the fact that these are aluminum and extremely light, they won't have an effect on wheel balance or anything like that. They're just giving me the space that I need. Now, I'm not in a place where I'm going to buy all new wheels for this just to accommodate that. These wheel spacers seem to work fine. Additionally, I have a new set of wheel studs that I'll be running so that I don't have, well, so I've got more thread engagement with my lug nuts, which I do think is very important. So I have these here. There's the part number. I'll post links in the description to this, and along with any additional information, also videos that are related to this, stuff that you might find useful if you're building up a Fox body like me. Anyhow, if you have automotive questions, I ask that you head over to EricTheCarGuy.com. I will link that in the description. Also, if you are subscribed to Eric the Car Guy, I ask that you hit the little bell icon so that you're notified when I post new videos. Aside from that, I want to thank you for watching. Be safe, have fun, stay dirty. I'll see you next time.